World War II displayed the best and worst traits of humankind. Among all the military branches, there was an unwritten code between fighting men that would simply be known as the warrior ethos. This was the act of showing respect to the enemy combatant, as they were all professional soldiers after all. However, fighter pilots, considered the knights of the sky, took the courteousness to the next level. Fallen aces were often treated with the utmost respect, no matter which side they fought for. If they were downed, they were buried with full military honors. Such was the case of two Royal Air Force pilots who lost their lives while conducting a raid over Jersey in the Channel Islands. The two pilots were buried in 1943 with full honors by the occupying German garrison. It was exemplary air chivalry. The brutality of war. The two world wars of the 20th century were brutal conflicts in which millions of soldiers and civilians lost their lives fighting for their comrades in respective countries. The gruesome ground battles, air raids, and sea battles showed how far men would go to survive and protect those they loved the most. Seasoned veterans of consecutive campaigns embodied the stereotype of the soldier that had grown accustomed to the brutality of war. But men drastically changed their perception of the war as it progressed and became more personal and violent. As the body count increased at the different fronts during World War II, the participating armies began to put aside the Geneva Convention that dictated how the war had to be conducted. This included how prisoners of war had to be treated during wartime, the protection of cities and regions with no military presence, and why it was dishonorable to shoot down a pilot after being ejected from his aircraft. The violent clashes between the German and Soviet armies at the Eastern Front quickly reflected the true nature of warfare, and taking the lives of the prisoners and wounded became a common practice. The other fronts quickly followed, especially after the continuous and brutal pummeling of German cities bombed by the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces. Still, British, German, and American fighter pilots tried to refrain from committing such atrocities. Taking as inspiration the ace pilots of the Great War, and especially the deeds and honorable conduct of the legendary Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen, pilots did their best to behave as true warriors. The Knights of the Sky. At the beginning of the war, there was a strong sense of chivalric virtues between British and Teutonic pilots. Both the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force promoted these ideas. According to Article 42 of the Geneva Convention, it was forbidden to attack pilots that had bailed out of their aircraft. The same applied to airmen that had surrendered once on the ground. Even considering otherwise went against a pilot's pledge, and striking down a defenseless man making his way to the ground with a parachute was considered an act of cowardice. However, these rules were not without controversy. During the Battle of Britain in August 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Royal Air Force Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding discussed the morality of taking down parachuting enemy pilots. Some officers believed that any Englishman was entitled to down a Luftwaffe pilot parachuting into British territory, as he was considered a potential enemy combatant. Others thought differently and considered that any soldier or pilot should refrain from shooting a parachuting German pilot as they were defenseless, and would become prisoners of war once they landed on British soil. As controversial as he sometimes was, Churchill considered that shooting a parachuting pilot was equivalent to drowning a sailor, and the Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich and leader of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, agreed. A decorated World War I ace pilot himself, Göring shared the antique Prussian romantic view of warfare. Luftwaffe pilots were taught to respect the enemy combatant. However, the shifting nature of the war would also change the rules as the war approached its end. During a conversation with some of the most famous Luftwaffe aces of the war, Göring asked them what they thought of shooting down enemy pilots while they were parachuting. One of the most famous replies came from a rising leader, ace pilot Adolf Galland, who said to Göring, quote, "I should regard it as murder, Herr Reichsmarschall. I should do everything in my power to disobey such an order." One of the most incredible stories of World War II involved a German pilot that spared the lives of a battered B-17 crew. His name was Franz Stigler, and seconds before destroying the American bomber, he remembered the words of his Luftwaffe commanding officer, who once told his students, quote, "You will follow the rules of war for you, not your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity." Stigler then decided to spare the lives of the Americans and help them reach friendly lines before reaching German-controlled territory. Decades after the war ended, Stidler was able to meet the crew of the B-17 bomber, and he was asked why he let them live. He responded, quote, "It was the most heavily damaged aircraft I ever saw that was still flying. I cannot kill these half-dead people. It would be like shooting at a parachute." Many more acts of honor would take place until the war ended, and one of them happened during the countless British attempts to retake the Channel Islands from the German occupation. RAF men die with honors. In September of 1939, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Months later, Germany launched an impressive series of offensives that significantly damaged France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. By June of 1940, the Third Reich had expanded its power across all of Europe. The British forces stood alone, and there was little they could do to stop the Wehrmacht. In the aftermath of the Battle of France, several British aircraft took off from the Channel Islands close to Normandy for their last bombing run in France and Italy. After that feat, the British government decided that the islands of Jersey and Guernsey were of no strategic importance and were left defenseless against the Germans. Churchill was furious and argued that it was shameful that the Crown give up its oldest possessions without firing a single shot. The last British troops left the Channel Islands on June 20th, 1940, and German soldiers arrived 10 days later. Both islands would remain under German control for the duration of the war. Later in the war, several British commandos attempted to infiltrate the islands for reconnaissance and search missions, and to halt several operations, but most were unsuccessful. There was also a public outrage, and the general population forced the British government to refrain from further missions, as civilians would be harmed the most. During one of these operations, Royal Air Force Sergeants Abraham Holden and Dennis Butlin were contacted by radio for immediate assistance on the island of Jersey. After taking off from Bern in Yorkshire on a mission over Frankfurt, Germany, the men made radio contact with Sergeant Ogling for immediate support and turned around. However, when the RAF pilots approached Jersey, they were shot down by the German garrison. The bodies of Holden and Butlin were eventually washed up on the shores of St. Queen's Bay on June 3, 1943, and taken to the hospital chapel on June 5th. The islanders visited the coffins of the deceased to pay their respects before and after the religious services. After being covered with the Union Jack, the island's German military commander allowed the Luftwaffe pilots to escort the remains of the RAF pilots to the island's cemetery. Hundreds of islanders lined up and followed the German honor guard, and upon entering the ceremony, the Luftwaffe closed ranks and buried the 2 British pilots with full military honors. Enough chivalry. During the war, gestures of chivalry in the area would become common between German, British, and American pilots. The occupation of the Channel Islands was mostly peaceful between the Germans and the civilian population, and as part of the Atlantic Wall defenses, the German forces built several fortifications. During the invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, the Allied forces bypassed the Channel Islands because of its strong defenses. However, the German supply line was eventually cut off, and both the Germans and the British began to suffer from starvation. In August of 1944, the German Foreign Ministry proposed releasing all civilians from the Channel Islands except those fit for military service. The offer was made through the Swiss Red Cross, but it was rejected by Britain. Churchill would say, quote, "Let them starve. They can rot at their leisure." The islands would not be liberated until the end of the war on May 9th, 1945. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content. And let us know in the comments below what you think of the acts of chivalry conducted by fighter pilots during World War II.